Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and the shadow beneath the steeple, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Father Brown's Most Chilling Case. The dead man was still speaking, but his lips never moved. The voice echoed through the dimly lit church, soft yet undeniable, slipping through the cold air like a whisper from beyond the grave. Father Brown knelt beside the body, his breath shallow, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached out. The man's eyes were wide, staring upwards at the vaulted ceiling as if he had seen something beyond human comprehension in his final moments. But the worst part was not his lifeless body sprawled upon the stone floor, nor the eerie silence that filled the room. It was the fact that Father Brown recognized the voice. It was the voice of the dead man, speaking in the present tense, describing a crime that had not yet happened. The body had been discovered just past midnight by one of the church caretakers, a man so shaken by the sight that he could barely form words when he arrived at the rectory. Father Brown had dressed quickly, pulling his heavy coat over his nightclothes, and followed the caretaker through the winding, mist-laden streets. The church loomed ahead, its steeple disappearing into the thick London fog. Inside, the flickering candlelight cast unnatural shadows against the cold stone walls. And there, at the foot of the altar, lay the corpse. His clothes were immaculate, his hands folded neatly across his chest, as if someone had carefully arranged him after death. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, just an expression of pure terror frozen onto his face. The first thing Father Brown noticed was the unnatural stillness of the room. The silence was absolute, oppressive, as if the very air held its breath. And then, without warning, the whisper came. A voice, thin, distant, yet unmistakably belonging to the man lying motionless before him. "He's coming," it said, "but he doesn't know it yet." The words did not belong to the dead. They belonged to the future. Father Brown did not believe in ghosts. His faith was strong, his logic unshaken by superstition. But this was something else entirely. He examined the body, searching for a clue, a rational explanation, anything that would tell him how a man could die so peacefully in a locked church, only to speak after his passing. But there was nothing. No wounds, no marks, not even the faintest sign of distress. And yet, as he traced his fingers along the cold skin of the man's wrist, he felt something unusual, a pulse. A shiver ran through him as he pressed his fingers firmly against the lifeless arm. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. The man was dead, but his body was not. He stood, forcing himself to remain composed, and turned to the caretaker. The poor man was still trembling near the entrance, unwilling to step any closer. Father Brown's voice was calm, but firm. "Who is he?" The caretaker swallowed hard before answering. "No one knows, Father. The doors were locked. There were no visitors tonight. He wasn't here when I checked an hour ago. Then he was." That answer was worse than none at all. A man who appeared out of nowhere, a body with no sign of harm, a voice that should not exist. These things defied reason. And yet, as Father Brown stood in that silent church, a dark certainty settled over him. This was no ordinary crime. The police were summoned, and the inspector arrived within the hour. His name was Mallory, a man known for his skepticism, for his complete and utter disdain for anything that did not fit neatly within the realm of facts. But even he hesitated when he saw the body. His men searched the premises, tested the doors, checked every possible entry point. There was no sign of forced entry, no explanation for how a dead man had arrived in a locked church, no indication of who had placed him there. Then the whisper came again. This time it was clearer. He is already inside. Every hair on Father Brown's neck stood on end. The words came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. The inspector spun around, his revolver drawn, but the church was empty. The constables exchanged uneasy glances, their previous bravado cracking under the weight of something they could not see. Then came the first real horror. The body moved, a slow, deliberate shift, one arm sliding from its place, fingers twitching against the stone floor. The constables gasped. Mallory cursed under his breath, and Father Brown took a single step forward, his voice calm, despite the tremor in his chest. "My son," he whispered, addressing the impossible, "if you are truly here, tell us why." The corpse did not respond, but the candles did. A gust of wind that did not exist blew through the church, and every flame went out at once. Darkness swallowed them whole. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of hurried breathing, of boots shifting uneasily against the cold floor. Then, footsteps, not from any of them, but from somewhere beyond the altar. Slow, deliberate, each one echoing through the cavernous room like a death knell. Father Brown's grip tightened around his rosary. Something was coming. The footsteps drew nearer, though no shape emerged from the shadows. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the very walls of the church were closing in. And then, without warning, the candles flickered back to life. The body was gone, not shifted, not dragged away, simply no longer there. The silence that followed was worse than the whispering. Inspector Mallory's expression was unreadable. His jaw clenched so tightly it seemed as though he might shatter his own teeth. One of the constables let out a nervous laugh, too loud, too unnatural, the kind of laugh that only comes from a man on the very edge of fear. "Well, then," he muttered, "that's a new one." But Father Brown did not speak. He was staring at the ground where the body had been. The stone was still cold, untouched, as if no one had ever been there at all. But there, scratched into the floor by a hand that should not have moved, was a single word. "Run." Mallory turned on his heel. "Seal the church," he ordered, his voice tight. "Nobody enters. Nobody leaves. Not until we understand what the hell just happened." Father Brown exhaled slowly. He did not believe in ghosts. He did not believe in curses. But standing in that dimly lit church, surrounded by men who refused to look each other in the eye, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Something was still inside, and it had only just begun. Chapter 2. The murder Father Brown concealed. The body was never supposed to be found. It had been hidden so well, buried beneath stone and secrecy, that not even the most determined detective could have unearthed it. And yet, as the rain poured down on the small village of St. Jude's, the earth rejected its secret. A hand, pale, stiff, reaching for the sky as if trying to escape the grave, had surfaced near the chapel steps. The discovery sent shockwaves through the village, whispers growing into frantic accusations. But the real horror began when Father Brown arrived at the scene, looked at the hand protruding from the ground, and whispered something so chilling that the constable beside him turned white. I knew this day would come. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The constable, a man not easily rattled, finally found his voice. "Father, what do you mean?" But the priest said nothing. He simply closed his eyes, as if offering a prayer for the dead, or perhaps for himself. When the body was fully exhumed, the village watched in horrified anticipation. The corpse was remarkably well preserved, its suit still intact, the skeletal fingers still clutching something small and metallic. As the inspector pried it free, a collective gasp echoed through the crowd. It was a cross, a small silver crucifix, its edges worn from years of wear, and engraved on its back was a name, Father Brown. The whispers turned into murmurs. The murmurs turned into accusations. The village priest, the man who had heard every sin in whispered confessions, the man who had buried more souls than he cared to count, was now at the center of a murder mystery. But when Inspector Mallory turned to question him, Father Brown was gone. The search began immediately. A priest does not simply vanish, especially not one as recognizable as Father Brown. His absence sent the villagers into a panic. Where had he gone? Why had he disappeared the moment the body was discovered? And most importantly, had he buried it himself? Hours turned into days, and no trace of the priest could be found. But then, on the third day, a letter arrived at the constable's station. No return address, no signature, only a single line written in careful, deliberate script. Some crimes should never be unearthed. The constables stormed the chapel, desperate for answers. They turned over every pew, searched the sacristy, even checked beneath the floorboards. And then, in the candlelit stillness of the confessional booth, they found him. Father Brown sat motionless, eyes hollow, hands folded in his lap. He had been sitting there for hours, perhaps days, waiting. Inspector Mallory stepped inside, closing the heavy wooden door behind him. "Tell me what happened." His voice was steady, but his fingers twitched slightly at his side. Father Brown exhaled slowly, his breath shallow, as if speaking would drain him entirely. "I am afraid, Inspector, that this is a story you do not want to hear." But the inspector only tightened his jaw. "Tell me anyway." The priest's gaze drifted to the flickering candle on the wall, watching the flame dance as if it too was whispering secrets. "He came to me on a stormy night," he finally said. "A man seeking refuge. A man running from something. Or someone." Inspector Mallory leaned forward. "Who?" A sharp pause. And then, so softly, it was almost inaudible. "A dead man." The words sent an icy shiver down Mallory's spine. He had questioned countless criminals, had unraveled more murders than he cared to remember, but this was something different. He sat in that very booth, Father Brown continued, his voice eerily calm. He confessed to a crime that had not yet been committed. The inspector frowned. "Explain." Father Brown laced his fingers together, his knuckles turning white. "He told me he would die that night, and that I would be the only one who knew." A heavy silence settled between them. The inspector's mind raced, fitting the pieces together. "Are you telling me," Mallory said slowly, "that the man we found buried outside knew he would be murdered?" Father Brown nodded once, and he asked me to keep his secret. Mallory's pulse quickened. "Who killed him?" The priest did not answer. The inspector's patience was wearing thin. "Damn it, Brown. If you know, it was not a murder." The words stopped Mallory cold. Father Brown's voice barely rose above a whisper. He was already dead. A long silence filled the air, thick and heavy, pressing down on them both. The inspector's hands balled into fists. "What are you saying?" Father Brown turned to face him fully. "I buried him, Inspector." Mallory stared. "He asked me to." A breathless moment passed. Then, knocking. The sound came from outside the confessional. Slow, deliberate. Someone was listening. Mallory turned sharply, yanking open the door, but there was no one there. The air in the church had grown thick, suffocating, as if the very walls had been waiting for this conversation to happen. Father Brown remained seated, his eyes dark, his face unreadable. "You were never supposed to find him." Mallory's mind spun. Was Father Brown protecting a murderer? Had he played a role in the crime? And if the dead man had known he would die, had he also known that his body would be discovered decades later? Before Mallory could speak, the candle in the confessional flickered once, then went out. Darkness swallowed them whole. And in that suffocating blackness, a whisper came. Some graves should remain undisturbed. The next morning, Inspector Mallory returned to the chapel with reinforcements. But when they stepped inside the confessional, Father Brown was gone. The booth was empty, the air stale, as if no one had occupied it in years. And beneath the wooden seat, where he had been sitting, a single item had been left behind. The silver crucifix, the same one found in the dead man's hand. No one saw Father Brown again. The villagers whispered that he had vanished into the mist, swallowed by the sins he had chosen to bear. Some believed he had fled, while others murmured that he had been taken, claimed by something older than justice, something darker than law. The chapel was closed soon after. No priest would take his place. And in the years that followed, one truth remained. The body had been found, but the murderer had never been named. And the only man who knew the answer had chosen to disappear. Chapter 3, A Sinister Secret. In church. The body should not have been there. It lay sprawled across the altar of St. Michael's Church, arms outstretched, face frozen in an expression of silent horror. The man was dressed in the ceremonial robes of a priest, but he was not the priest of this church. No one knew who he was. No one had seen him enter. And worst of all, St. Michael's had been locked from the inside all night. Father Brown stood in the flickering candlelight, his gaze locked on the single word carved into the dead man's chest. The letters were deep, precise, deliberate, as if the murderer had wanted them to be read. Confess. The word was fresh, the cuts clean. The man had been alive when they were made. A cold weight settled in Father Brown's chest. There were murders that came from passion, crimes of greed, of revenge. But this was something else. This was a ritual. Outside, the villagers gathered in the rain, whispers turning to hushed prayers, fear threading its way through their voices. No one wanted to speak too loudly. No one wanted to admit the thought lingering in their minds. This was no ordinary murder. This was a message. Inspector Mallory arrived moments later, his face pale and tight, the flicker of the gas lamps reflecting off his damp coat. He took one look at the body and exhaled sharply. "Tell me you've seen this before, Father." Father Brown's fingers tightened around the cross at his chest. "I wish I could, but there was something wrong about this crime, something that felt familiar and yet entirely foreign, all at once." And then the whisper came, soft, distant, a voice that did not belong to anyone in the church. "He deserved it." Mallory spun, revolver drawn. The constables held their breath, but the room was empty. Yet the whisper had been there, clear as a confession. Something in St. Michael's was watching, and it was not finished. The investigation began immediately. The doors had been locked from the inside, the windows unbroken. No one could have entered. No one could have left. And yet a man had died here. A man no one recognized, dressed as a priest, with a word carved into his flesh like a final warning. Mallory examined the body with sharp precision, his gloved fingers running along the edges of the carved letters. "Whoever did this wanted us to see it." Father Brown nodded. "And they wanted us to understand something." Mallory frowned. "Understand what?" The priest's eyes darkened. "That this was only the beginning. By dawn, the villagers refused to enter the church. St. Michael's had stood for nearly 2 centuries, its bells calling the faithful to prayer, its walls keeping secrets as old as the town itself. But something had changed. The crime had tainted it. People no longer felt safe inside. And then came the second discovery. A book, found in the confessional, hidden beneath the wooden seat. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, its spine cracked from years of handling. And inside, Father Brown's own name, written over and over, page after page, not in ink, but in dried blood. Mallory's face paled. "What the hell is this?" Father Brown ran his fingers along the faded letters, his pulse steady, despite the unease curling in his gut. A warning, or an invitation. Mallory stepped back, arms crossed. An invitation for what? Father Brown closed the book gently. To confess. The first piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source, a woman who had been at evening prayer the night before. She had seen something, or rather someone, a man in priest's robes, kneeling in the front pew, whispering to himself. She had not seen his face, but she had heard what he was saying. A single sentence, repeated over and over. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I should never have opened the door." Mallory stiffened. "What door?" The woman shook her head. "I don't know, but I remember something else." "What?" The woman hesitated, and then, in a whisper, "He was laughing." The deeper they searched, the less sense the mystery made. The body belonged to no one in the village, no records, no visitors who had entered the town recently. And yet, the man had known St. Michael's. He had come here, alone, whispering about a door that should not have been opened. And that was when Father Brown found it. The hidden passage beneath the altar. The constables pried at the stone floor until a section gave way, revealing a narrow stairwell leading deep below the church. Mallory lit a lantern, his face grim. "How old is this?" Father Brown exhaled. "Older than St. Michael's itself." The air below was thick, damp, carrying the scent of rotting wood and something else beneath it, something metallic. "Blood." Mallory swallowed. "I don't like this." Father Brown stepped forward. "Neither do I. They descended into the darkness. The passage led them to a room that should not exist. Ancient walls lined with faded symbols. A single chair in the center, its wood rotted but still upright. Chains hung from the ceiling, rusted with age. And at the far end of the room, hidden beneath layers of dust and time, a door. Mallory ran his fingers over its surface. Sealed shut. Father Brown nodded. For a reason, the carvings around the door were intricate, deliberate, a warning. Written in Latin, "Let no man open what was meant to remain closed." Father Brown turned to Mallory, his voice lower than before. "This is what he meant." Mallory exhaled. "What do we do?" The priest glanced back at the door. Then softly, "We leave it." But as they turned to go, the door knocked. Once, then twice. Then it opened. The lantern flickered violently, the air shifting as if something had exhaled from the darkness beyond. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. A long, narrow corridor stretched out before them, leading into nothingness. Then, footsteps, not their own, slow, measured steps approaching from the blackness. And then, the laughter returned. Soft. Wrong. Too close. Mallory grabbed Father Brown's arm. "We need to leave. Now." The priest did not argue. They climbed the stairs quickly, sealing the hidden passage behind them, leaving whatever was inside to the dark. The next morning, the body was gone. The villagers refused to go near the church. Some left town entirely. Others whispered that St. Michael's had always been cursed, that something beneath the floor had been waiting. Father Brown said nothing, but as he walked past the empty altar, past the pews that would never be filled again, he heard something. A whisper. "Forgive me, Father, but it's too late to confess." And when he turned, the door beneath the altar was open. Chapter 4. Why Father Brown hesitated. Here. The knife was still warm, in the dead man's chest. Father Brown's hand hovered over the hilt, his breath shallow, his heartbeat a slow, rhythmic drum against his ribs. He had seen death before, too many times to count, but never like this. Never in a place like this. And never with a certainty so overwhelming that it made his hands tremble. He knew who had done this, and yet, for the first time in his life, he hesitated. The body lay, sprawled across the cold stone floor of the abandoned rectory, its walls heavy with dust and secrets. A single candle flickered in the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. There was something wrong about this death, something unfinished, something that was watching. And then the whisper came, soft, barely there. "You're too late, Father." Father Brown turned sharply, his pulse racing, but the room was empty, except for the corpse. And yet, the whisper had been right behind him. The villagers of Pendleton had always avoided the rectory on the hill. It had been abandoned for years, its doors locked, its windows covered in thick layers of dust. No priest had served here in decades, but last night, the doors had been open, and now there was a body inside. Inspector Mallory arrived within the hour, his coat still damp from the rain, his expression unreadable. He had seen gruesome crimes before, but there was something in his eyes as he looked at the scene, something unsettled. "Tell me, Brown," he murmured, voice low, "why did you stop just now?" Father Brown did not answer immediately. He let his gaze drift over the dead man's features, his lips curled slightly upward, almost as if he had died smiling. But it was not a smile of peace. It was a mockery. He swallowed. "Because I think," his voice faltered, I think I've seen this before. Mallory frowned. What do you mean? Father Brown exhaled, slowly, his fingers tightening around his cross. This murder has already happened. A chill ran through Mallory. Explain. Father Brown hesitated. Last night, I had a dream. About this room. About a man being murdered here. And when I woke up, I knew I would find him. Mallory studied him carefully. Are you telling me, he said slowly, that you saw this death before it happened? Father Brown didn't answer, because somehow he had. The body belonged to a man named William Harrow. No known residence, no family, no records of him ever existing in Pendleton. And yet, someone had known him. Someone had lured him to the rectory. Someone had killed him with a knife that should not exist. Mallory examined the weapon, turning it over in his gloved hands. This isn't an ordinary blade, he muttered. Father Brown's stomach twisted. No, he said quietly. It's not. The knife's handle was worn, its blade ancient, older than the church itself. A symbol had been carved into the steel, its edges rough, as if it had been scratched in haste. Father Brown recognized it immediately. It was a sigil of excommunication, a symbol meant to banish something unholy, and yet it had been used to kill a man. Mallory exhaled sharply. What does it mean? Father Brown swallowed. It means this wasn't just murder, Inspector. He looked back at the dead man's face. It was a warning. That night, Father Brown could not sleep. The rain lashed against the windows of the church, the wind howling like a living thing. The air inside was thick, heavy with something unspoken. And then, at precisely 3 a.m., he heard it. A single knock. Soft, deliberate, coming from inside the confessional. Father Brown rose, his breath shallow. He stepped into the chapel, the candlelight flickering as he approached the booth. Another knock, and then a voice. Why did you hesitate, Father? He swallowed hard. Who's there? Silence. Then the confessional door creaked open. The booth was empty, and yet, on the wooden seat inside, something had been left for him. A single black feather. His blood ran cold, because he knew what it meant, and who it belonged to. The next morning, Mallory was waiting for him outside the chapel, his face pale. The body, he said, his voice strangely hollow. It's gone. Father Brown stiffened. What do you mean? Mallory clenched his jaw. Harrow, the corpse. It disappeared from the mortuary last night. A long silence stretched between them. And then softly, it wasn't meant to be found. Father Brown turned, his mind racing. Something deeper was at play here. Something older than justice, older than the church itself. He looked up at the rectory on the hill, the place where he had hesitated, and for the first time in his life, he wished he had never stepped inside. The investigation grew stranger by the hour. No signs of forced entry. No footprints. No evidence that a body had ever been at the mortuary at all. The records had vanished. Even Harrow's name had been erased from the books. It was as if he had never existed. But the knife remained. And so did the feather. Mallory exhaled, rubbing his temples. Brown, I don't like this. Father Brown studied the feather in his hands, turning it over carefully. Neither do I. Mallory took a slow step forward. Tell me the truth. Father Brown's eyes darkened. About what? Mallory hesitated. Then voice, barely above a whisper. About why you hesitated. A long silence, stretched between them. Then finally, Father Brown spoke. "Because I've seen that man before." Mallory's breath hitched. "Where?" Father Brown lifted his gaze, his voice heavy. "In a grave." The next night, Father Brown stood before the abandoned rectory once more. The wind had died down. The world felt still, as if something was waiting. The door was open, the candle inside flickered, and on the floor, a single black feather lay in the exact place where the body had been. Father Brown exhaled. "You should not have come back," he murmured. The candle flickered out, and in the darkness, something laughed. The body was never found again. The knife disappeared, and no one ever spoke of William Harrow again. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is still and the church is silent, Father Brown hears it. A single knock at the confessional, a whisper in the dark, and he knows. He was supposed to hesitate, because some things are not meant to be solved. Chapter 5. The Deadly Confession. He heard. The voice inside the confessional was not human. Father Brown sat in the dim wooden box, his hands folded, waiting for the next confession. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and burning candles, the only light coming from the faint glow outside the lattice screen. The whispers of the village had been growing louder in recent weeks. Talk of strange disappearances, locked doors swinging open in the dead of night, and a presence lurking in the shadows of St. Augustine's Church. But Father Brown had heard it all before. He had always believed that no place was truly cursed, only the hearts of men, until now, because the voice that spoke to him through the thin screen was something else. Soft, hollow, dead. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." It was the same phrase he had heard countless times, yet something about it made his breath catch. The tone, wrong. The syllables stretched too long, each word lingering in the air, as if reluctant to leave. Then came the words that sent an unnatural cold through his bones. "I was murdered last night." The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time in his life, Father Brown hesitated. The next morning, the village was awash in whispers. A man had been found dead in the river, his body caught between the reeds, his clothes still damp from the night's rain. No wounds, no bruises, no indication of how he had died. And yet, when they turned him over, his lips were still moving. The villagers screamed. The constables could not explain it. But Father Brown knew, because that was the man who had confessed to him last night, and he had spoken to him after he was already dead. The body was taken to the coroner, but even the doctor could not explain it. The heart had stopped, the lungs held no breath, yet the expression on his face was not one of death, but of terror. His eyes were open wide, pupils dilated as if he had seen something no man should ever see. Father Brown stood beside Inspector Mallory as they examined the corpse. The inspector, a man not prone to superstition, was visibly shaken. "You heard him confess last night?" he asked. Father Brown nodded. "Yes." Mallory exhaled sharply. "And he said he had been murdered." "Yes, and yet we found no wounds on him." A long silence passed between them. Then Mallory muttered something under his breath. Then how the hell did he know? The investigation should have been simple. A drowning, perhaps. A sudden heart failure. But nothing about this case was simple. Because when they went to search the dead man's home, they found something impossible. A single candle was still burning. Father Brown stood in the doorway, staring at the flame that had not gone out, despite the rain, despite the cold. It flickered once, then shrank, as if acknowledging him. He knew, Father Brown murmured. Mallory frowned. Knew what? The priest turned, his face unreadable, that he wasn't alone when he died. The deeper they searched, the darker the truth became. The dead man's name was Alistair Finch, a local school teacher, known for keeping to himself. No family, no close friends. A man who had no reason to be murdered. Yet, as they scoured his home, Father Brown found something that made his stomach turn. A small black book, hidden behind a loose brick in the fireplace. The pages were filled with names, dates, confessions, and then scrawled across the last page in a shaky hand, his own name. Father Brown will hear it next. Mallory cursed. What the hell is this? Father Brown closed the book slowly. It's a list of confessions. Mallory raised an eyebrow. So, you hear confessions every day? The priest's hands tightened over the cover. Not like this, because every name in the book was already dead. That night, Father Brown did not sleep. The church was quiet, save for the occasional flicker of candlelight against the stone walls. He sat in the front pew, the small black book resting on his lap. And then, the knock came. 3 sharp raps against the confessional door. Not from the outside, from inside. His breath hitched. Slowly he rose, stepping toward the booth, fingers brushing against the wooden frame. Then, a whisper. You should not have listened, Father. He flung the door open, empty. But sitting on the seat inside was another black book, identical to the first, and this one had a new name written inside, Mallory's. The next morning, the inspector was found unconscious in his home. His pulse was weak, his breathing was shallow, no wounds, no poison, nothing to explain why he would not wake. Father Brown sat beside him, staring at the man who had once been so full of fire, now pale and still. A doctor murmured, It's as if he's trapped in a dream. The priest clenched his fists. Or a confession. Something was taking them, one by one. And now it was coming for Mallory. Desperate for answers, Father Brown returned to the church, back to the confessional. He sat inside, waiting, listening. The minutes stretched into hours. Then, the whisper returned. Do you wish to confess? His fingers dug into the wood. Who are you? Silence. Then, laughter. Not loud, not mocking, just patient. You already know. Father Brown's breath slowed. He did know. It was not a person, not a ghost. It was the act of confession itself, a hunger for sin, a void that demanded to be filled. And it had been listening for years. Mallory woke up 3 days later. He could not speak at first, could not move. When he finally did, his voice was hoarse, weak. I saw it, he whispered. Father Brown leaned forward. Saw what? Mallory's gaze darkened. The thing that listens. His hands shook as he reached for Father Brown's wrist. It's waiting for you next. The priest swallowed hard. He already knew that, because the night before, someone had slipped a piece of parchment under his door. A new confession. A name written in fresh ink. His own. The church is still there. The confessional remains. The candles still burn. But the booth is never used anymore. And some nights, when the world is quiet and the air feels heavy, Father Brown swears he hears something. Not voices, not prayers, just listening, waiting for the next confession. And one day, it will be his. Chapter 6. Father Brown's nightmare comes true. The coffin was empty. Father Brown stood in the dim light of the cemetery chapel, his breath slow and steady. The grave had been fresh, the burial performed just 3 days ago. And yet, when they had lifted the lid of the coffin, the body was gone. No sign of forced entry, no disturbed earth, no rational explanation. Inspector Mallory, standing beside him, swore under his breath. The constables whispered among themselves. The gravedigger, the one who swore he had seen the body laid to rest, refused to speak at all. And then, from the far side of the chapel, the whisper came. Soft, too close. "You should not have opened it." Mallory spun, revolver drawn. The constables tensed, but the chapel was empty. Father Brown swallowed hard, because he had heard that voice before. In his dreams, it had started 3 nights ago. A dream so vivid, so real, that when he awoke, he could still smell the scent of damp earth and candle smoke. In the dream, he was standing at this very grave, his fingers trembling as he reached for the coffin lid. And then, the whisper. You should not have opened it. But dreams were just dreams, or so he had thought. Then came the letter. No return address, no signature, just 6 words, written in precisely the same handwriting he had seen in his nightmare. Do not open the grave, Father. That was why he had hesitated when Mallory had asked him to be present for the exhumation. That was why his fingers now trembled, despite the cold logic in his mind telling him that this was simply a case of body theft. But as he stared into the empty coffin, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Dread. The investigation began immediately. The villagers of Pendleton were silent, eyes avoiding the constables as they moved through the streets. No one wanted to speak about the grave. No one wanted to acknowledge what had happened. Finally, one woman, a widow named Eleanor Finch, spoke. She had been at the cemetery 2 nights ago. She had seen something, or rather, someone. A man, Father, she whispered, standing by the grave, but he wasn't moving. He was just watching. Mallory frowned. Did you recognize him? Eleanor hesitated, and then, voice barely above a whisper, that was the problem. I did. Mallory narrowed his eyes. Who was it? Her lips trembled. It was the dead man. Silence fell over them. Father Brown felt the hairs on his arms rise. Are you certain? Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. I spoke his name, Father. I said, Edward, and he smiled at me. Mallory exhaled sharply. That's impossible. Eleanor just shook her head. He was standing right there. And then she whispered something that froze Father Brown to his core. But he didn't have any eyes. The deeper they investigated, the stranger it became. Edward Gibbons. The man who had been buried 3 days ago, the man who had supposedly been seen standing by his own grave, was a complete mystery. No family, no records of birth, no proof he had ever existed before arriving in Pendleton 6 months ago. Mallory was furious. How does a man exist without a past? Father Brown, however, was thinking of something else, something that had haunted his dreams for years. This had happened before. It was nearly midnight when the second letter arrived. Father Brown found it slipped under the door of the rectory. The same precise handwriting, the same lack of signature, but this time the message was different. You should not have looked. His blood ran cold. He turned, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing against the walls of the church. And then, a knock. 3 slow raps against the door of the confessional. But Father Brown already knew. No one was inside. The next morning, another body was missing. This time, it was Eleanor Finch. Her house was empty, the door left wide open, no signs of struggle, just gone. But there was one thing left behind, a candle, still burning on the kitchen table, and beside it, a note. Father Brown picked it up, his fingers tightening around the fragile paper. I saw him again. He told me the truth. Mallory clenched his jaw. What truth? Father Brown exhaled slowly. That he was never buried at all. They found Eleanor 2 days later. Not in her home. Not in the woods. But in Edward Gibbon's grave. Her body was perfectly preserved. No wounds, no sign of struggle. As if she had simply laid down and stopped existing. And in her hand, the same black candle that had been left burning in her home. Mallory's voice was unsteady. What the hell is happening? Father Brown had no answer. Because there was something else. Something that should not have been there. The soil beneath Eleanor's body was disturbed. As if something had crawled out. And then, as the wind whispered through the trees, the grave knocked. Father Brown did not sleep that night. The church was silent, yet the air felt heavy, as if it too was waiting. Then, the final letter arrived. No envelope, no ink, just words, scratched into the wood of the confessional door. It wasn't a nightmare, Father. It was a warning. His breath hitched, because he understood now. The dreams, the voice, the grave that had been opened. Edward Gibbons had never existed, because he had never been a man at all. Pendleton no longer speaks of what happened that autumn. The grave remains sealed. The church stands empty. And yet some nights, when the world is quiet, and the air is thick with the scent of candle wax and damp earth, Father Brown swears he hears it. Not voices, not prayers, knocking, soft, deliberate, coming from beneath the ground, waiting to be opened again. Chapter 7. A shadow followed Father Brown. The first time Father Brown saw it, he thought it was a trick of the light. The second time, he thought it was his imagination. But by the third time, when he saw it standing at the foot of his bed, motionless, watching him in the dark, he knew it was real. And worst of all, it was not human. It began on a cold November evening, as Father Brown walked back to St. Mary's Church. The village of Ravenshire had been unusually quiet that day, its streets empty, the air thick with the scent of burning wood and damp stone. He had performed a funeral that morning, a man whose name had already begun to fade from the villagers' lips as if he had never existed at all. As he turned the corner toward the rectory, he saw it, a shadow. At first, it seemed like nothing. A stretch of darkness too long for the gas lamp behind it, moving slightly against the windless night. But something about it made his skin prickle. It was too still, too deliberate, too aware. He paused, gripping his rosary tighter. The feeling of being watched crept over him like an unseen hand, pressing into the space between his shoulders. And then it moved, not away, toward him. He turned sharply, but when he looked again, it was gone. That night, he locked the doors. Not out of fear, but out of something far more dangerous, uncertainty. Father Brown had encountered many evils in his time, murderers, liars, thieves. But this was different, because a man can be caught, a man can be reasoned with, but this was something else. And then the knock came, soft, measured, from inside the church. He hesitated before stepping into the nave. The candlelight flickered against the stained glass windows, casting distorted figures along the stone walls. Everything felt wrong. And then he saw it again. The shadow. It stood at the far end of the pews, still as death, its shape too tall, too narrow, its edges frayed like torn cloth. But shadows do not stand on their own, and they do not turn their heads. Father Brown swallowed. "Who are you?" No answer. A long silence stretched between them. The church was heavy with the kind of quiet that was not truly empty, the kind of quiet that comes when something is listening. Then, the whisper, low, hollow, wrong. "You should not have buried him." The air in the room dropped. Father Brown's breath came out in a visible mist. His fingers curled around the rosary at his chest, but his voice remained steady. "Buried who?" Another pause. Then laughter. Soft. Close. Right behind him. He spun around. Nothing. But when he turned back, the shadow was gone. By morning, Father Brown was exhausted. He had spent the night in his study, unable to bring himself to sleep, staring at the flickering candle until the first hints of dawn broke through the window. He told himself it was exhaustion, that he had imagined it, until the villagers came running. There had been another funeral scheduled that morning, but when they arrived at the cemetery, the coffin was open, the body was missing, and in its place, something had been left behind. A single shadow, burned into the earth in the exact shape of a man. Inspector Mallory was furious. "A grave robbery," he snapped, pacing the cemetery grounds. "In a village as small as this? Who the hell would—" His voice cut off, because he had seen it too. The shadow, pressed deep into the earth, as if something had stood there too long. Mallory exhaled, rubbing his temples. "This doesn't make sense." Father Brown studied the outline carefully. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." Mallory gestured to the villagers, still standing at a distance, whispering among themselves, "They're scared. Half of them won't come near the church anymore." Father Brown sighed. "Fear has power, Inspector, especially when we do not understand what we are afraid of." Mallory frowned. "And what are you afraid of, Father?" Father Brown hesitated, then quietly, "That we did not bury a man at all." That night, he waited. He sat in the pews, hands folded, breath steady. The candlelight flickered against the stained glass, the air thick with the scent of wax and old stone. He had a feeling, a terrible, unshakable feeling, that it would return, and at exactly midnight, it did. The shadow stepped through the church doors. This time, he did not flinch. It moved differently now, more fluid, more human, but it was not human, because shadows do not breathe. And yet, he heard it, a slow, deliberate inhale. "You should not have buried him." Father Brown tightened his grip on the pew. "Who?" The whisper came again. "You know." A chill ran down his spine. The missing body, the open coffin, the shadow that stood on its own. A name formed in his mind, one he had not spoken in years. A man who had died long ago, but perhaps had never truly been buried. Mallory had been wrong. The villagers had been wrong. This was not a grave robbery. This was a return. By dawn, the church doors were locked. The villagers refused to enter. Even Mallory was uneasy, keeping his hand close to his revolver whenever he spoke to Father Brown. "Tell me honestly," he muttered, "do you believe in ghosts?" Father Brown studied the morning fog rolling over the empty graveyard. Then softly, "Not ghosts." Mallory frowned. "Then what?" Father Brown turned to him, his face unreadable. "Something older than ghosts." Mallory exhaled sharply. "So what do we do?" The priest hesitated. Then quietly, "We wait." Mallory scoffed. "For what?" Father Brown did not answer, because he already knew. The shadow would come again. It always did. Some nights, Father Brown dreams of it. A dark figure, standing at the edge of his vision, watching. It does not move. It does not speak. It only waits. And one day, it will step forward. Chapter 8. The parishioner who vanished overnight. The door was locked from the inside. The windows had not been opened. The bed was still made, the candle on the bedside table half burned, the wax frozen in time. Nothing in the room suggested a struggle. And yet, when Father Brown stepped inside that small, stone-walled cottage on the edge of the village, he knew someone had disappeared from this room, and they had not left by normal means. It had been less than 24 hours since Mrs. Eleanor Wright was last seen. A devoted churchgoer, she attended evening mass every night, always seated in the third pew from the back. She was not the kind of woman to vanish, yet here they were. Father Brown stood beside Inspector Mallory, whose face was paler than usual, his fingers twitching at his side. He didn't like cases like this, cases where logic had no place. "You're sure she was here last night?" Mallory muttered. The woman who had reported Eleanor's disappearance, her neighbor, Mrs. Dalton, nodded fiercely. "I saw her with my own eyes," she said, voice trembling. She locked the door, as she always does, and in the morning, she was gone. Father Brown scanned the small single-room cottage. It was untouched. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no misplaced objects, just absence. It was as if she had simply been erased. The first strange detail came from the bed. The sheets were cold, not just undisturbed, but icy to the touch, as if no one had lain there for days. But the candle, still half melted, suggested that Eleanor had been awake shortly before she vanished. "She went to bed last night," Father Brown murmured, "and at some point between then and morning, she disappeared." Mallory exhaled sharply. That's impossible. And yet, it had happened. By midday, the villagers had gathered. No one wanted to say it. No one wanted to suggest the one thing they all feared, that Eleanor Wright had not left, that something had taken her. Father Brown saw it in their faces, the fear, the superstition, creeping into their whispers. This was no ordinary disappearance, and they all knew it. Then, a man stepped forward. He was old, frail, his face lined with age and something deeper, something like knowledge. "She was the last," he whispered. Mallory stiffened. "The last what?" The old man exhaled. "The last one who saw it." Silence fell. And then, Father Brown understood. Eleanor Wright had seen something, and now she was gone. The investigation deepened. Father Brown spoke to those who knew Eleanor best. A quiet woman, devout in her faith, never married, no enemies to speak of. But 2 weeks before her disappearance, something had changed. She had started locking her doors earlier. She had stopped going out at night. And, most telling of all, she had begun sitting in a different pew. She never explained why, Father Brown asked. "Mrs. Dalton." The woman hesitated. Then, in a whisper, she said she felt watched. Mallory frowned. Watched by who? Mrs. Dalton's eyes darted toward the church. She never said. But Father Brown already knew. Not by who, by what. That night, Father Brown returned to the church. The air was too still, The candles flickered despite the absence of wind. And when he stepped into the confessional, lowering himself onto the worn wooden bench, he felt it, a presence, something unseen but undeniably there. He inhaled slowly. "Who are you?" No answer. Silence stretched. Then, a whisper. "She looked too long, Father." His breath caught. The voice did not belong to anyone in the church. It came from behind the confessional wall. But he was alone. The next morning, the second disappearance was reported. A young boy. His bed untouched, his candle burned halfway down, and just like Eleanor, his door had been locked from the inside. Mallory clenched his jaw. "This is impossible." Father Brown stared at the boy's room. It was identical to Eleanor's. The same frozen sheets, the same untouched belongings. But there was something new, something that should not have been there. A mirror, standing in the corner of the room, facing the bed. And when Father Brown stepped in front of it, his pulse stopped. Because for a split second, he was not alone. A shadow, standing behind him. And then, it was gone. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat in Eleanor Wright's cottage, waiting, watching. And just past midnight, he heard it, a creak, soft, deliberate, from the mirror. He turned slowly. The reflection was not his own. He saw the room behind him. The flickering candle, the chair, the door, and something standing in the doorway, watching him. A shape, wrong, not human. The whisper returned. "You should not have looked." The candle died. The room plunged into darkness, and Father Brown felt breath on the back of his neck. They found him the next morning, unconscious on the floor. The mirror had shattered, and where it had stood, a second shadow was burned into the wooden floorboards, identical to the ones left at the gravesite a month ago. Mallory stood beside him, his expression unreadable. "What happened?" Father Brown exhaled shakily. "They weren't taken, Inspector. They were pulled." Mallory's voice was tight. "Pulled where?" The priest's hands clenched around his rosary. "Into something they were never meant to see." The disappearances stopped after that night. Eleanor Wright was never found. The boy was never found. And in the years that followed, no one in the village spoke of them again. The cottages were abandoned. The church stood empty, and every mirror in Ravenshire was covered, draped in cloth, or broken. But sometimes, late at night, Father Brown still dreams of it. The mirror, the whisper, and the thing that had been watching him from the other side. Chapter 9. Father Brown's unfinished investigation revealed. The case had been closed for over a decade. The files were buried in the archives, the evidence forgotten, and the names of the dead left to fade like old ink. But when Inspector Mallory unlocked the storage room beneath Scotland Yard, there it was, Father Brown's last unfinished case. And the moment he opened the folder, his blood ran cold. Because inside was a photograph of a man who had been declared dead 12 years ago. And that man had been seen walking through St. Mary's Church last night. Father Brown had never spoken of this case, not to the police, not to the church, not to anyone. But it was clear from the notes, the scrawled handwriting in the margins, the torn pages stuffed into the file. He had been afraid, and Father Brown was never afraid. Mallory scanned the papers. There were names he recognized, official reports, coroner's statements, confessions given in candlelit rooms. But then, deeper in the file, he found something else. A single page, written in Father Brown's own hand. "I was wrong. He is not dead." The investigation had started in 1912. A small village, a missing priest, a church that stood in eerie silence while the rest of the world moved on. Father Brown had been called in because something was wrong. The villagers had whispered of a figure that should not have been there. A man who had been buried, yet was still seen kneeling in the front pew after dark. Some believed it was a ghost. Others said it was a demon wearing the priest's face. But Father Brown did not believe in ghosts, and that was why he had stayed. The first night in St. Jude's Church had been quiet. Too quiet. Father Brown sat alone, the air thick with the scent of wax and damp wood. The pews were empty. The confession booth is silent. The graveyard beyond the church doors untouched. But he felt it, a presence, watching, waiting, and then the knock came, not at the door, not at the confessional, but from beneath the floor. The next morning, Father Brown had pried up the floorboards near the altar. What he found should not have been there. A second coffin, not buried in the graveyard, but hidden beneath the church itself. He traced his fingers over the lid, old wood splintering beneath his touch. There was no inscription, no name, only one word, carved deep into the wood. Forgive. Father Brown hesitated. Then, heart-pounding, he opened it. Inside the coffin was a suit, a black cassock, neatly folded, a rosary resting on top, but no body, no bones, no sign that anything had ever decayed inside it. Father Brown exhaled, his breath unsteady. He knew what this meant. The missing priest had never died. He had been hidden, and someone had kept his secret for all these years. Mallory flipped through Father Brown's notes, heart pounding. The case had never been solved. The villagers refused to speak of what had happened. No records were ever made public. The coffin had been sealed again, and Father Brown had left the village, never to return. But there, at the bottom of the file, was the final note. Written in red ink, "He is still out there." Mallory's fingers trembled. 12 years had passed, but last night, someone had seen the priest walking through St. Mary's Church, alive and smiling. Father Brown had always believed in justice. He had never abandoned a case, but something had made him walk away from this one. Something had made him afraid to finish it. And now, it had come back. Mallory knew what he had to do. He had to go back, to the church where it all began, to the place where Father Brown had first seen something that defied reason, to the grave of a man who was never truly dead, and pray that this time he would not vanish too. Chapter 10. A Killer Stalks the Confessional. The voice behind the confessional screen was calm, steady, almost emotionless. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." Father Brown had heard these words countless times before, but something about the way this man said them felt wrong. Then came the second sentence, "I am going to kill again." A silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The wooden booth suddenly felt too small, too dark. The candle outside flickered once, then steadied, as if the very air had stopped breathing. Father Brown's fingers tightened around his rosary. He knew that whoever sat on the other side of the screen was not seeking redemption. This was not a confession. It was a warning. It began 2 weeks ago. A brutal murder had shaken the quiet village of St. Augustine. A woman found dead in her home, her throat cut so precisely it almost seemed surgical. No forced entry, no struggle, just an open window, a single drop of wax on the floor, and a rosary placed carefully on the victim's chest. Mallory had been skeptical. A robbery gone wrong, perhaps, or a jealous lover. But Father Brown knew better. The killer is confessing, he had told Mallory. This was deliberate, methodical, and the crime itself. It's only part of the ritual. Mallory scoffed. You think he's religious? Father Brown hesitated. I think he's watching. The second murder came 4 days later. This time, a shopkeeper, found in the back of his store, hands clasped together as if in prayer. The confessional was empty that night. But when Father Brown arrived at the church the next morning, something had been left for him. A single piece of paper, folded neatly, slipped under the confessional door, with just 3 words written inside. I am close. The constables increased their patrols. The villagers stopped going out after dark. But it didn't matter, because the third victim was found inside the church itself. A young man, barely in his 20s, discovered slumped over in the very pew where he had prayed just the night before. The cause of death, strangulation, the evidence, none, except for the wax again. A single drop near his feet, and the whisper that came just before the body was found, a whisper that only Father Brown had heard. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. That night, Father Brown did something he had never done before. He locked the confessional, and he waited. The candlelight flickered. The wooden walls of the booth creaked softly in the cold. Hours passed, and then a knock, soft, slow, deliberate. Father Brown exhaled, steadied himself. Come in. The door creaked open. A figure entered, sat down, and spoke. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. Father Brown's breath was slow, measured. What is it you seek forgiveness for? A pause. Then, in a whisper that felt too close, for what I will do next. The next morning, Mallory found Father Brown sitting alone in the empty church. He was here, the priest murmured. Mallory stiffened. You saw him? No, but I heard him. Mallory clenched his jaw. What did he say? Father Brown slowly turned to look at him. He said he's going to kill again. A heavy silence settled between them. Mallory exhaled sharply. Did he say who? Father Brown's fingers tightened. No, but he left something behind. He held up a small scrap of paper, with just 2 words written on it. Next Sunday. The church was full that day, perhaps because the villagers were seeking comfort, perhaps because somehow they knew. Father Brown scanned the congregation carefully, his eyes moving over every face, every bowed head. Somewhere in this room, the killer was watching. He felt it. And then he saw it. A man, sitting near the back, still, too still, his face unreadable, his hands folded neatly, and, beside him, a single candle, melting slowly, wax dripping onto the wooden bench. Father Brown stood, slowly. The man did not move, but when the sermon ended and the villagers began to leave, he was already gone. Nothing left behind, except for a note, left on the pew where he had sat, a note that made Father Brown's stomach turn. You hesitated, Father. That night, the confessional was empty. Father Brown sat in silence, waiting. And then, the knock. Slow, deliberate. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. His breath hitched. The door creaked open. But this time, there was no one inside, just an empty seat and a single candle, still burning. The next morning, a woman was found dead in her home, strangled. A rosary placed on her chest. But something was different this time, because beside her, There was a note, and for the first time, the killer had signed his name. Father Brown stared at the paper, his hands shaking. Mallory swallowed. "What does it say?" Father Brown exhaled. Then, quietly, "It says he's not done. The church remains open. The confessional still stands, but the booth is never used anymore. And sometimes, when the air is too still and the candles burn a little too long, Father Brown still hears it, the whisper. Forgive me, Father." And he knows. The killer is still out there, still watching, and one day he will return. Chapter 11. The One Crime He Regrets. The letter arrived at exactly midnight. No sender, no signature. Just an old, yellowed envelope slipped beneath the heavy wooden door of St. Mary's Church. Father Brown, sitting alone in his study, nearly ignored it, until he saw the wax seal. Black, a color that was almost never used. His breath slowed as he broke the seal and unfolded the fragile piece of parchment. The ink was smeared, the handwriting erratic, as if written by someone on the edge of madness. There were only 5 words on the page. "You got the wrong man." Father Brown felt the blood drain from his face, because he knew exactly what crime this letter was talking about, and it was the only one he had ever doubted himself on. It had happened 15 years ago, a case that had haunted him in ways he never spoke about. The murder of Henry Calloway, a wealthy landowner found dead in his study. A single bullet wound to the chest, the gun lying just inches from his outstretched hand. It should have been simple. A crime of passion, perhaps. A dispute over inheritance, money, secrets hidden within the walls of the Calloway estate. The evidence had pointed to one man, James Law, Calloway's closest friend. The villagers had whispered about Laura for years, that he was jealous of Calloway, resentful of his wealth, that he had always loved Calloway's wife. And when they found him covered in blood, standing over the body, the case had seemed open and shut. Father Brown had listened to the testimony. He had heard James Law's final words before he was sentenced. "You've made a mistake, Father." And then the hangman's noose tightened around Laura's throat. For years, Father Brown had buried the case deep in his memory. But now, the letter had arrived, and it meant only one thing. The real killer had never been caught. The next morning, Father Brown arrived at the old Calloway estate. The house had been abandoned for over a decade, its once grand windows now covered in dust and cobwebs. The villagers refused to go near it. Some believed the ghost of James Law still haunted its halls. Others believed that Henry Calloway's murderer had never truly left. Mallory joined him at the door, his revolver already drawn. "You really think there's something to this?" Father Brown exhaled. "I don't think, Inspector. I know." They stepped inside. The air was wrong, heavy, the kind of silence that only exists in places where terrible things have happened. And then they saw it, a candle, burning in the middle of the study, the very same room where Henry Calloway had died, and beside it, a note, written in the same erratic handwriting as the letter. "Come alone, Father." Mallory was furious. "It's a trap." Father Brown said nothing, because he already knew that. That night, as the village slept, Father Brown returned to the Calloway estate, alone. The study was darker now. The candle burned lower. Shadows stretched across the walls like long, reaching fingers. And then, the voice. "You took an innocent man's life, Father." Father Brown's breath stilled. "You let them hang him." He turned slowly. The chair in the corner of the room was occupied. A figure sat there, cloaked in darkness, watching him. "Who are you?" Father Brown whispered. The figure leaned forward. The candlelight flickered, catching the edge of something metallic. In his hands, a gun. "The man you left to die." The past unraveled in an instant. Father Brown saw the trial, the sentencing, the way James Law had stared at him in those final moments, and for the first time, he truly doubted himself. What if the villagers had lied? What if the evidence had been planted? What if the real murderer had been sitting in that very room, watching as an innocent man was led to the gallows? The figure in the chair exhaled. "You were supposed to see the truth." Father Brown's voice was steady, but his hands clenched into fists. "Tell me who you are." A long pause. Then the figure stood, the candle died, and Father Brown was alone. By morning, Mallory found him standing outside the estate, his face unreadable. "Did you see him?" the inspector asked. Father Brown nodded once. "And?" The priest looked up at the sky, dawn breaking over the rooftops. "We got the wrong man, Inspector." Mallory stiffened. "So, who was the right one?" Father Brown closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were filled with something Mallory had never seen before. Regret. "I don't know." The case was reopened, the files unsealed. The villagers were forced to re-examine their own memories. And as the truth began to emerge, the real horror became clear. James Law had never killed Henry Calloway, but someone had made sure he took the blame, and that someone was still out there. The investigation continued. The Calloway estate was searched, its dark corners exposed to the light. But they never found the man in the chair. They never found the true killer. And the letters, they never stopped. Every year, on the anniversary of James Law's death, another letter would arrive. No name, no return address, just the same 5 words. "You got the wrong man." Father Brown does not speak of the case, but sometimes late at night, as the church bells toll in the distance, he still sees it. The shadow in the chair, the whisper in the dark, and the one crime he will never forgive himself for. Chapter 12. Father Brown's final warning ignored. The letter arrived 3 days after the last murder. No one knew who had sent it. No one knew how it had made its way to St. Mary's Church. But when Father Brown unfolded the brittle parchment, its words written in trembling ink, his heart nearly stopped. "You told them not to open the door. They didn't listen. Now, one by one, they will die." It had started with a warning, a simple, clear instruction. "Do not open the old crypt beneath St. Jude's Chapel." The message had been written on the church walls, scrawled in charcoal, barely visible in the dim candlelight. But no one had listened. The townsfolk had laughed it off. Superstition, they said. Nonsense. And then the first man went missing. His name was Edward Clark, a grave digger. He had been seen late that night, standing outside the crypt, his lantern flickering against the heavy iron door. He had been the first to ignore the warning. By morning, he was gone, and in his place, a single deep handprint was found, burned into the stone, as if something had pushed through from the other side. Father Brown had begged them to stop. "You must seal the crypt again, immediately." But Inspector Mallory had been skeptical. "You really believe an old tomb has something to do with this?" Father Brown had met his gaze with something close to fear. "I don't believe, Inspector. I know. But the door had already been opened, and whatever had been inside was no longer there. The disappearances continued. 2 more men, then a woman, each of them seen standing near the church before vanishing without a trace. By the time the town began to believe, it was too late. Father Brown sat in his study, poring over ancient texts, searching for something, anything, that might explain what had been unleashed. Then the whisper came, not from inside the room, not from the corridor, but from behind him. You should have stopped them. The investigation had reached a standstill. The town was on edge. The constables patrolled the streets, but no one knew what they were looking for. Then, the 4th victim was found. This time, the body had been left behind, but something was wrong. He was still standing, his face frozen in terror, his eyes burned black, as if he had seen something beyond human comprehension. And when they turned him over, a single phrase had been carved into his chest, not buried deep enough. Mallory turned to Father Brown, his hands trembling despite his usual bravado. "What is happening?" Father Brown exhaled, his voice quiet. "It is not a question of what, Inspector. It is a question of who." Mallory frowned. "Who, then?" Father Brown swallowed hard. "The one they tried to forget. The town records had been sealed. A name, erased from history. A burial, unmarked." Father Brown's hands trembled as he read the final entry from the church's archives. The body of Thomas Aldwych is to remain sealed within the lower crypt of St. Jude's. No rites shall be spoken. No grave shall be marked. His name shall not be remembered. A punishment worse than death, to be erased, to be nothing. But something had remembered him, and now it had returned. That night the church bells rang. No one had touched them, no one had pulled the ropes, and yet they tolled, long and hollow, echoing through the empty streets. Mallory and Father Brown arrived at St. Jude's just as the last chime faded. And then, from inside the darkened church, a single candle flickered to life. Someone, or something, was inside. They moved cautiously, stepping into the cold air of the chapel. The pews were empty, the altar untouched, and then they saw it, the crypt door, open. Father Brown's pulse quickened. "Inspector." Mallory stepped forward, revolver drawn. "We need to see what's inside." Father Brown shook his head. "No, that's exactly what he wants." Mallory frowned. "Who?" A long pause, then softly, "The man they buried alive." The records had been incomplete. Thomas Aldwych had not died before his burial. He had been entombed while still breathing, punished for a crime no one would name, and his final words had been scratched into the walls of the crypt with broken fingernails. "I will return." Mallory swallowed hard. "This can't be real." Father Brown turned to him, eyes dark. "Then why is the coffin empty?" They sealed the crypt. They placed iron chains over the door, reinforced the locks, covered the entrance with stone. But the town was never the same. The disappearances stopped. The bodies were never found. And yet, every year, on the anniversary of the first death, the church bells ring once more. No one touches them, no one pulls the ropes. But still, they toll, as if something beneath the earth is still waiting, still listening, still hungry,